is Britain's role in one of the great crimes of our age? We've watched for over 2 years now a live stream genocide, as we're talking now, despite a so-called ceasefire. Bombs continue to rain down on Gaza. The brilliant Peter Oborne, a journalist I've got endless admiration for, has just done an incredible book, which everyone needs to go and get, called Complicit: Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. And it really is, it's a masterclass in holding the powerful to account. It goes through, in a very rigorous way, how various parts of the British establishment, politics, media, and so on, helped facilitate a genocide, the crime of crimes. It's such an important piece of work, which I think will play a crucial role in what I keep referring to as the coming reckoning. Peter, it's an honour as ever to talk to you. How you did?
Well, it's a real pleasure to appear with and talk to you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Always. Let me just start. Some might go, well, Britain, does it really matter? The US is the hegemon, the superpower. Israel relies on the US more than anything. Does it really matter what Britain does when it comes to Palestine? What would you say to that?
I think it matters profoundly. I mean, I'm very proud to be British, and actually, as you know, I'm a sort of conservative Brit, and that's the tradition I come from. And we have our own system of values, which are independent of the United States. And when we had an empire 100 years ago, our Foreign Secretary, former Prime Minister A.J. Balfour, gave what is now Israel to the Israelis, a country which was lived in at the time almost completely by Palestinians. And so we created a situation where, and it wasn't at a time of colonialism. And so it was, I think, in the minds of British statespeople. We were constantly giving parts of the world to white settlers or whatever it was. We had very important strategic reasons to do that, i.e. the passage to India through Suez. We felt that the Zionist state would be a protection for that interest. And so we started this. We started off what for Palestinians has become a complete catastrophe. And we've continued to have a major role, even when we became a second-rate power. Not a fifth-rate power, as people say. We became a second-rate power, still on the UN Security Council. We have an enormous role to play and have played. And so we supply arms to Israel. We give it huge diplomatic support, etc. And so it's very disingenuous, the argument that people have that Britain you're only interested in it because you're anti-Semitic or you're obsessive. It's not the case. We, as Britain, have had a profound role in the invention or creation of Israel and then its subsequent relationship with the outside world.
I mean, it's interesting because, obviously, as you say, with the Balfour Declaration, Britain handed Palestine to the Zionist movement at the time, and when 90% plus of the inhabitants were Palestinian Muslims or Christians. And then, I mean, in the 1940s, it's just interesting what's memory hold, isn't there? Because there was a Zionist terrorist insurgency where they were blowing things up, including the King David Hotel, and they were killing British soldiers. And it was said that Queen Elizabeth II refused to visit Israel because of that history of terrorism. I just find that interesting because obviously we focus on, the discussion of terrorism, which Israel situates itself in. But actually, there was an insurgency, which included being an insurgency against the British Army.
Very much, and some brutal acts were carried out against British soldiers. A British commissioner in Egypt was assassinated, as was Count Bernadotte, the first the antecedent, as it were, of Albanese. The first UN mediator. He'd saved the lives of several hundred Jews during the Holocaust, but that didn't stop him being blown to bits by the I forget actually how he was killed by Nadot, but he was killed by the Israeli resistance or the Rezi. It's very important. This has also affected the way that Maggie, you say the Queen, the late Queen, also Maggie Thatcher, was very much aware, because she was dealing with Begin, the Israeli Prime Minister, had been the head of the Irgun, which had ordered the King David attack. And so that was in the minds of British statespeople for a long time. And I think we've forgotten that, because Thatcher, one of the things I look at quite carefully in this book is Thatcher's dealings with Israel, which she strongly supported. She was a huge supporter of Israel, and she felt it represented good values. But when Begin, ordered Sabra, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and then the Sabra Shatila atrocities took place, sanctioned and allowed by Israel, she was furious. And I unearthed a fascinating interview with Maggie Thatcher after the Israeli attack on the Iranian nuclear reactor, I think in 1981. Monty Maudlin, in the Jewish Chronicle, he said, "Look, you're letting us down. You're betraying Israel." And she gave in. This is international law. Is all we have. I am standing up for international law. You cannot imagine any current British leader, whether it's Starmer, a human rights lawyer, or Sunak, or let alone a Badenoch, saying something like that. She was grounded in morality of international law. And what we've seen from the current generation of leaders, both Labour and Tory, and is allowing, because we support Israel, we're allowing a massive attack, a really serious attack and degradation of international law.
It's really interesting, this point about what kind of shifted there, because it was similar to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, during that invasion of Lebanon, said to Menachem Begin that told him to call off this Holocaust. You can imagine Joe Biden. That was a Republican president, then you had a Democrat president. What in Britain? Because you said, with Margaret Thatcher, obviously not a personal hero of my own, but it's fascinating, of course, to hear or to read about how, someone very much associated with the right of politics in the 1980s did not have as stridently or uncritically pro-Israel positioning as later politicians. What happened? How do you explain what happened?
I think the biggest thing which has happened in the 45 years since was the rise of neoconservatism, because this is a doctrine in the States, it starts, very important here now too, which says we don't need to care about international law, we're about selfish national interests. That's how I interpret the neocon position. In fact, it's deeply hostile to international institutions. And this again is critical. You get in the aftermath of World War II, conscious of the horrors of the 1930s and of the Holocaust, Roosevelt, Churchill get together. Very much Britain is heart of this, to create the post-war international architecture, the United Nations Genocide Convention, later on the International Criminal Court, UNRWA, United Nations Refugees, and so on. And that is there to prevent these organizations, institutions, there to prevent a recurrence of the horror. It's very much in memory. The collapse of the League of Nations, remember, leads to World War II. Right. And I think it's partly forgetfulness of why we need institutions like this, forgetfulness of the horror of World War II, and a sort of arrogance, a sort of Western the neoconservatives are arrogant. They determine the shape of the world, nobody else. And that has led to a deep hostility to the United Nations, attempts to undermine it, call it anti-Semitic, Now, and the very important thing, which is absolutely terrifying, is the attack on the International Criminal Court. The US has issued sanctions against the chief prosecutor. Britain hasn't, neither Starmer nor the previous government complained about this. Part of that, therefore, David Cameron, as I show in the book, is part of the attack on the chief prosecutor. That's the British Foreign Secretary getting involved in the undermining of an international, really important international institution, which is there to punish international war crimes. And it is Maggie Thatcher, going back to Maggie, she would have been horrified. International law, she said, is all we have.
Before I just come on to the genocide, the pro-Israel lobby, and this is something you've written about, and not just written about, you investigated on television, and it's something often people find difficult to talk about because, I guess, as soon as you talk about the pro-Israel lobby, there's the danger people start throwing at you which is an anti-Semitic trope about shadowy Jewish power, and that trope is then often wrongly invoked when we're talking about the fact that there are organised attempts on behalf of a foreign state, and it's not the only foreign state that obviously mobilises and organises in that way, in order to, for example, avoid scrutiny or accountability for terrible crimes that have been committed. So how do you explain what is the kind of pro-Israel lobby, and when we get to the point of the genocide, just how powerful is that lobby?
Yes, you are right to warn that you can find yourself involved in anti-Semitic tropes. Gil Aked wrote a very good study recently of the pro-Israel lobby. She makes this point very well. Nevertheless, I think my background is as a political journalist, political reporter, and the way I've interpreted that job is to describe how power operates in Britain, and more recently, I've gone across the world. And if you want to understand how power operates at Westminster, one of the things you have to deal with is the power of lobby groups, whether they're domestic or foreign. And one of the most significant, I think, that Robert Rhodes James, the biographer of Churchill and a senior Conservative politician, called it the largest organization in Western Europe dedicated to the cause of the people of Israel. Now, that's a totally honorable position to take, but it's perfectly reasonable for a political journalist to try and explain how that works. And so I have a chapter on the pro-Israel lobby. I also talk about, of course, Labour Friends of Israel, which sent a mission to Tel Aviv, of course, while the slaughter was at its height, and to try and explain what they do and how they operate. And I do that. There are a lot of sources. You're quite right. People are terrified to talk about it. And that's what we found when made the Channel 4 film 15 years ago, that getting people to come on screen and talk about it was almost impossible. And I show here that the CFI, could claim the majority of MPs as members. I think he said at one point 80%. It develops a sort of direct relationship with the Boris Johnson Conservative Party, i.e. when important policy decisions would be made directly with CFI, not in the way you would expect, i.e. a Foreign Office would assess the matter, Foreign Secretary would make a statement to Parliament, issues would be, Boris Johnson would send a letter at one stage on a really important matters to do with the ICC directly to the officials of the CFI. That's completely irregular. It should have been made by the Foreign Secretary to Parliament. There was a bidding war, as I demonstrate, after Johnson went, really between Sunak and Truss. when the CFI held a hustings, Conservative Friends of Israel, which is lobbying for a foreign country, held a hustings during the 2019 election, the Truss Sunak election campaign. Oh. Now that, by the way, it's not unique. The Conservative Friends of India are allowed to do the same thing, but it's entirely inappropriate that that a foreign country, whether it's India or Israel or anywhere else, is able to have a direct say, and in a leadership election, which is going to determine the nature of the next British Prime Minister. The Alan Duncan business is fascinating. Alan Duncan's diaries show.
Just so everyone's aware, Alan Duncan's a former Conservative Foreign Office Minister. I, in fact, interviewed him about this saga on this channel.
Oh, that's we don't need it anyway. Basically,
tell us about this. It's really interesting.
Alan Duncan's diaries show how the Conservative Friends of Israel were able to prevent him becoming Middle East minister. Obviously, they obviously felt that he was pro-Palestinian, and that wasn't appropriate for a foreign office. But again, Maggie Thatcher, if you try to, any foreign lobby group would try to tell Maggie Thatcher how to, who to appoint as her Middle East minister, that wouldn't have been on. She would have kicked you out of the room. And it shows, I think, that a much wider point, actually, of here about contemporary British politics. It's politicians have less of a sense of, I'm running Britain, I stand up for Britain. Whether it's big business lobbies telling them, Google or BlackRock, there's a certain lack of national pride, that these moneyed people can turn up and tell you who they are, or national lobbies like CFI or the Conservative Friends of India can tell you, can affect policy. And it's a disastrous thing, I think. And I give lots of other examples. There's a fascinating study made by Al Jazeera which involves secret filming, which was closed down straight away. And they had evidence of a man called Shaima Sot, I think he was called, had some role within the Israeli embassy, nobody quite knows what, and he was talking about taking down British politicians who took a different view than Israel did about what which British interests were, and that was fascinating. I reported that film at the time. It was not touched by the mainstream press hardly at all. Johnson, who was then the Foreign Secretary, closed it down as an issue when it became a story that there was somebody in the Israeli embassy trying to take down British politicians. By nightfall, by close of play on the day the film went out, it had been closed as a story. Johnson had said, "There's nothing here I'm to worry about." It was this hilarious moment in the Johnson biography. Netanyahu comes to stay, and later on, says Johnson, somebody discovered a bug in the loo, which they can only have, since Netanyahu had gone there. And this was all a joke. So a foreign prime minister comes...
I'm glad you raised this, because I've been thinking about that for the last few days, It's quite interesting. I mean, I've just got it here. This was unleashed. He said he found a listening device in his personal bathroom at the British Foreign Office after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu used it. Thither, Bibi repaired for a while. It may or may not be a coincidence, but I'm told that later, when they were doing a regular sweep for bugs, they found a listening device in the Thunderbox. Just make you wonder that, doesn't it, Peter? You don't have to be... we don't have to go tinfoil hat over it, because Boris Johnson literally just said it. And you kind of think, well, what? Why would they do that? And, how much have they listened in on various politicians, and how much have they used that as leverage? I don't think that's jumping too many dots ahead and becoming tinfoil hat, is it really?
But it's also, if it had been Macron, say, another ally of Britain, or it would have been a scandal. It would have been it would have been splashed in all the papers. French spying on Britain. Let alone Xi, the Chinese leader. I mean, but the Israelis do it. It's all a bit of a joke, and that's quite telling, I think. And what it does tell you about, because I have a long section about the the kind of the preliminary British policy towards Israel, not before October the 7th, and I show how soft we were. How soft we were, during Cast Lead, during Protective Edge. We were good as gold, really. We wouldn't condemn the Israelis even though they were slaughtering Palestinians. I mean, I actually have I set out the system. If you would like me to, of the British government reaction to Protective Edge, in which casualties in Protective Edge, civilians killed in Gaza 1,600, civilians killed in Israel 6, children killed in Gaza 550, children killed in Israel 1, ratio 550 to 1. Homes severely damaged and destroyed in Gaza 18,000, homes severely damaged or destroyed in Israel 1. Ratio 18,000 to 1. And throughout this business, Britain was strongly in favour. And I go through it. So I go through this. It's a sort of this is a kind of manual for how Britain will later on behave. So for manual 1, thing 1, remind everybody that Israel has a right to defend itself. And I give a quote from David Cameron. Unambiguously condemn and blame the official enemy. I provide the quotes from Cameron again. Limit discussion of Palestinian victims to non-specific lamentations over the tragedy of man. Do not impute any bad intent or criminal responsibility to Israel. Express, quotes, concern, end quotes, about civilian casualties and general pro forma statements about the general need to comply with international law. Issue futile calls for investigations which will go nowhere. Refuse to support international investigations even though you previously demanded them. Keep sending arms to Israel no matter what. Send humanitarian aid to Gaza to be moderate and responsible. Reflexively blame, we're seeing an example of this as we're talking now, reflexively blame the official enemy whenever ceasefire negotiations fail. Gravely reiterate support for a two-state solution. Back Israel when it blocks a two-state solution and act mystified when a two-state solution doesn't turn up. And finally, optional, confide later what was really going on to Israel lobby groups. Yeah. So that was Philip Hammond later on talking to the CFA saying, we're on your side. I mean, and that's before we get on to the...
well, that point, we'll come on to the genocide. I mean, it's just interesting, the point you make about the two-state solution as it's used as a rhetorical crutch by politicians, because what you'll often notice throughout the genocide is when British politicians are asked about specific allegations of Israeli crimes, I'm afraid by generally badly briefed or informed presenters who do not press them on these issues, but they'll raise something about, I don't know, Israel blocking aid or something in a kind of general sense. And then the politician will use the two-state, what we need to do is work towards a two-state solution. They're using it not because they think there's any realistic chance of that happening. They're using it to get themselves out of that particular situation and that particular question. It's like, it's the,
Muggins in the TV studio back in London. Oh, it nods very gravely. Yes, a two-state solution. I mean,
exactly.
As at this moment, we are seeing the West Bank being erased. Palestinian communities, as we speak, the settlers are going in there armed with guns, destroying the Palestinian machinery, knocking down their houses, shooting them if they complain, and bringing in the IDF to help. And so any prospect at the moment of a two-state solution is being obliterated. And the British government, have you heard from them on that subject? Have there been any complaints? I mean, we can still, under the British government, do you realise we can still buy settlement produce? We're actually financially supporting these. I mean, these settlers, as they go, these are fascist militias going village to village across the West Bank as we speak.
I mean, I know you've just come back. I was there myself a few weeks ago.
You were. You were reporting superbly from. They are fascist.
They are. It's really, when you're there, because you can feel, being in a vice in terms of what the Palestinians are going through. With this context then, so with the genocide beginning over 2 years ago now, let's start with the Conservative government and how they responded. I'm just interested in, because we go back with David Cameron, he was Prime Minister before, he obviously comes back as Foreign Secretary. So I don't know if there's much to say about Rishi Sunak generally, but I mean, with that, just that general response, but also David Cameron, because he did once say Gaza was a prison camp. And I'm just interested in the role you think he played and what the role of that government was up till, of course, last July.
I think Cameron played a major role because he was such a senior figure. James Cleverly, who he replaced, was really out of his depth.
Cleverly by name, not by nature. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. He might have been quite clever, but he really didn't have any personality. At one point, he was interviewed by Secunda Kamani. I don't know if you remember, shortly after October the 7th. He allowed himself really to his Israeli counterpart, who's not very distinguished, came across him and sort of answered a question for him. He really didn't have any real sense of who he was or what Britain was about. And David Cameron has a lot of swagger to him. He had been Prime Minister, and he was an able man. And what was so terrible about Cameron as Foreign Secretary was time and again he just didn't stand up for Britain, what we stand for. I mean, so when Israel produced what we now know as a fabricated memo, which he sent around news organizations, which swallowed it up, that UNRWA was, full of Hamas sort of sympathizers, or actually activists, I think, military people. Cameron just accepted it and suspended British funding of UNRWA, which was the big organization supplying humanitarian aid into Gaza. Cameron went on supplying arms. He wouldn't despite endless evidence of Israeli atrocities. Then he tried to meddle with the ICC investigation into Netanyahu and Hamas and Gallant. He tried to stop it or delay it. That was quite a shocking thing for a British Foreign Secretary to do. And so that was a very, very upsetting that we should have a foreign secretary doing that. And I think he basically was running the negotiations. When Cameron turned up, you cited he called Gaza a prison camp 15 years ago, by the way. And I thought he might sort of give a bit of spine to Sunak, but not at all. He was shocking. And we now know Middle East Eye has done some really important work about the attempt of Cameron, apparently, to interfere with the ICC case by approaching the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan. And according to MEE, he said Britain would defund the ICC. But friends of Cameron I've been in touch with, they deny that, but they do accept that Cameron rang up. That in itself, I think, is very serious. And he rang up Karim Khan. They accept that, and they say that Cameron did warn about reaction of the Conservative Party if Karim Khan went ahead and did put arrest warrants out for Netanyahu. Now, that's in itself, it seems to me to be wholly inappropriate. I think Mr. Cameron, or is he, Lord Cameron, I apologise, has a load of questions to ask about his behaviour.
It's interesting as well because he, for example, as you note in the book, he says at one point, one issue we would like the Israelis to look at is switching the water back on into northern Gaza because that would make a difference. He also wrote a very detailed letter to Alicia Kearns, the Conservative MP, who was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which detailed various ways that Israel was deliberately and systematically blocking aid getting to Gaza. Now, some might go, well, that's commendable. Bless him. Why are we having to go at him? But that makes it worse because it's a confession. Because there's no point if you're there stating all the war crimes, which
these are war crimes, collective punishment.
Yeah, you're not calling them that, but you're continuing to arm and all the rest Israel. Then what are you doing other than confessing to a crime you're facilitating?
I agree. And one of the very disappointing things about this is this was a gift to Labour if it was doing the job of an opposition to British. And Starmer was the leader of the opposition. He was a human rights lawyer. These were this open gifts. I remember. It was like, imagine Robin Cook had been leading the Labour Party. What he would have done on the floor of the House of Commons across the dispatch box. And yet the Starmer was just sort of a lump. There was no sort of protest at this. There are some good things which Starmer did, and I want to. We mustn't end this conversation without saying what they were. But Starmer's failure to oppose, particularly during the early months of the war, when Israel was slaughtering so many Palestinians. There were more than 25,000 by the end of January. 2024, it was relentless, and Starmer during that period had nothing to say. He in fact supported collective punishment at one point, and that was amounted really to what I think was a cross-party cartel supporting Israel, which is and remains a semi-fascist government. It has fascist elements as it carried out atrocities on an epic scale.
Notorious LBC interview with Keir Starmer. Sir Keir Starmer, I do apologise if we're going to get people's titles correct. And this was, I think, the 9th of October, when he was asked by Nick Ferrari, a siege, Sir Keir Starmer, cutting off water, energy, is that appropriate? And then Keir Starmer says, well, I think Israel does have that right. And then says something about international law, that it's not possible to reconcile those two statements because neither of us are human rights lawyers, but we do understand the basics of, for example, Article 33 of the Geneva Convention. Israel doesn't have the right to impose a siege on a civilian population. That is entirely illegal by any interpretation of international law. There's no ifs or buts about that. You can't then say, well, also he needs to buy. Anyway, but he then gaslit everyone about it and said he never, which he tends to do. He never believed what he never said what he said, basically. Why does that matter, though? Because some might go, well, look, he wasn't running the country. Why did it matter that Keir Starmer, at that particular point, for example, basically said that Israel has a right to impose an illegal siege on a civilian population when he wasn't in power? Why does it matter?
He was leader of the opposition, and he had a fantastic opportunity to show leadership. The Conservatives had, do you remember, I think Sunak had said that there was unequivocal support for Israel. Starmer could have said, look, Hamas had committed the most terrible atrocities on October the 7th. Of course, Israel has the right to respond. But I'm saying to Israel, look, you mustn't break international law. You mustn't commit war crimes. Imagine the moral authority which Starmer could have lent to that situation, and the sense of balance and decency and what Britain actually stands for. But no, Starmer didn't do that. He folded in behind the unprincipled and morally disgusting conservative support for Israeli barbarism, which started to happen very soon after October. People forget this now, but the bombing, the slaughter started almost at once. 5,000 civilians have been killed, according to Air Wars, before the end of October, within about 3 weeks. 5,
and they say that was a conservative estimate as well. They said that's the most conservative estimate.
Yeah, so they're bombing buildings, destroying families. It's disgusting what is going on by that stage. It's not. You don't have to wait until much later to realise that something had gone terribly wrong.
Hmm. Before I just ask about the media, our beloved industry, just in terms of what happened, and I think you write about this brilliantly, and this is you as a political journalist really coming into your own, I guess, and this is about what happened last February 2024 when the Scottish National Party submitted used one of their opposition days, so they get very few opposition days, in which they call for a ceasefire, but also they specifically attribute, they call for an end to collective punishment or something, which then goes into the question of legality. What do Labour do, and what does the Speaker do? Because this is a gruesome moment, in my opinion, which I wrote about at the time.
Yeah, it's a terrible moment in British politics. So the Scottish National Party are very inconvenient. As you say, it's not just that they're calling for a ceasefire, it's that the language they use, end to collective punishment. And it's a nightmare for Starmer. There'd been an earlier SNP motion, remember, in the November, I think, which called for a ceasefire, and it had split Labour. And some very principled Labour shadow ministers had voted for a ceasefire. And Andy Slaughter, for instance, who gave up his political career, he would have been Solicitor General in the current administration. And but by February 2024, the split was much bigger. You were getting threats of shadow cabinet ministers going to quit. There's going to be a massive Labour split. It was a nightmare. And so Starmer was stuck between doing what he wanted, which was to cleave essentially to whatever Biden was doing. It was not so much he was cleaving to Biden, but that if he was going to do that in this SNP motion, he would lose maybe 100 of his own MPs. And imagine the devastation that the Tory press would have been able to inflict on Labour, split over the great issue of our time. You can understand you've got to feel sympathy with his predicament. But the way it was solved, and we're still absolutely not certain what happened, but Starmer has that private meeting ahead of the debate with the Speaker Hoyle, and Speaker Hoyle ends up breaching Commons convention and allowing Labour to put its own motion, which solves the problem, but it's completely against not against the rules exactly, but against convention. And so that ceasefire motion is no longer going to be heard. It does lead to Commons uproar. You may remember that the Tories are furious at the breach of convention. The Scottish nationalists, rightly so. Mm-hmm. And so Hoyle and Starmer. Hoyle emerges abominably from this business. I mean, it looks like he's given in to pressure from the leader of the opposition, and there are reports of threats directly to reports of threats. I'm going to be careful directly to Hoyle from Labour that if you want to stay Speaker after the next election, which we're going to win, by the way, you really are going to have to give in to us. That's reported. Now, the way Hoyle gets off the hook, it leads to a moral panic. He comes back to the House, having obviously shaken people. He's really been beaten up by opposition MPs, presumably, or people, particularly the SNP. He's being accused of betraying his duty as Speaker, following giving into pressure from the leader of the opposition. His response is he comes out and says, "I did it in the interests of members of the House of Commons who are being threatened for their safety." Now, that's what he says. He doesn't say anything more than that, but he's given a lifeline to Starmer, but he's also given a lifeline to the far right. And they immediately interpret this as Islamist pressure on British MPs. Sectarians have taken over the House. And Michael Gove is the first person he sees it. He's now the editor of The Spectator. He's really the Islamophobe in chief in Britain and has been for a good 10 years. And he writes goes to the Sun. He gives an interview to the Sun, saying, respect the ref. He stands up for Hoyle. But the real problem is these Islamists. And I tried to track down what Farage has been saying in the States. He's at one of these awful sort of far-right conferences which they have in the States. And he says something vaguely similar. Douglas Murray, the far-right polemicist, comes in, and suddenly, and the whole media narrative flips, almost just like that. And suddenly it's Islamists have taken over Parliament. And it becomes a national panic.
It leads to Suella Braverman, doesn't it? Writing in the Telegraph that the British police are under the thumb of Islamists. I mean, this is what's so fascinating about it. It causes this whole kind of it blows up. This ruse basically to destroy the SNP's ceasefire motion. Then sets off this chain reaction of Islamophobia, which then goes to Suella Braverman saying. When she was home, she wasn't Home Secretary at the time, but she wrote saying that this was that showed the police were under the thumb of Islamists.
Yeah, it's not just. I mean, say, Jake, this is. I went through this carefully. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, British democracy prostrated itself to an Islamist mob, and quite shamefully, Rishi Sunak, who's the Prime Minister. As a Prime Minister, you're meant to you'll have a duty to calm down tensions. He talks about legitimate protests hijacked by extremists to promote and glorify terrorism. I mean, it's in Parliament this week, a dangerous signal was sent out that this sort of intimidation works. So basically, in order to get off the hook, Hoyle has blamed violent threats to MPs, and it's been inflated into Muslims are dangerous terrorists who are putting the whole of British democracy into, and of course this is gorgeous for Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage. The Daily Telegraph goes bonkers. All of the papers goes bonkers, and it's based on a fabrication. I looked at all the footage of the protests that there were pro-Palestinian people outside Parliament that day. They weren't violent. They weren't intimidating people. I examined all of I went out of my way to examine, find cases of MPs being threatened. There weren't any, and it's a horror. And of course, and the biggest thing, with a big giveaway here. If it really was the case that there were violent threats to MPs, that British democracy had given in to pressure from violent people, this would be unprecedented in British history, and there would have been an inquiry into it. The Speaker should have ordered, what happened on the 21st of February. There's never been an inquiry. They don't want to get the answer. Who were the threats coming from? Was it foreign powers? Was it Islamists? What? No. They've never asked that question. Nobody has ever looked into it because it was a fabrication. It was a joint media political fabrication which pilloried and ostracized and drove public-spirited people who were against. What are they against? They're against what many experts believe to be a genocide, but they're being pilloried as anti-British, sectarian, etc. And that has gone on. That narrative still exists. It's very powerful. We saw another example of it the other day in Aston Villa Maccabi. We saw another example of it there.
We did. I mean, that was another particularly gruesome low point. Just about, on that, the British media, there's so many elements to it. So I'm just interested in your kind of what really strikes you. It's everything from the lack of pretense Palestinian life has any meaning whatsoever, the whitewashing of Israeli crimes or erasure. I think what's also, one thing that I often harp on a lot, and you talk about the overt genocidal statements made, the kind of avalanche of genocidal statements of intent, and these statements of intent were often, wasn't like if they were covered at all, they were buried with no kind of explanation of what they actually represented, or they just weren't covered at all. And they proved the most accurate roadmap to what Israel would in fact do, because they went out and said what they were going to do from the beginning. They said they were going to wipe Gaza from the face of the earth. They said they were going to treat its people as basically legitimate military targets. There's no demarcation between civilians and Hamas. We could go on. I mean, what just strikes you, because it is, I think, the biggest scandal of Western journalism of our time. So, what are your general thoughts?
You should the South African submission to the ICJ in early 2024, or was it the back end of 2023, contains a rather voluminous compilation of these statements, and as you say, it was the Israeli leaders from Netanyahu downwards were setting out what they were going to do, and they've done it. It's very interesting to look at the South African submission, because it says that we weren't. It's ridiculous to talk about intent, even though there's so much evidence of it. And I think that's one of the reasons I feel that it's extremely likely that the ICJ will decide it's been a genocide, is that what was said in the immediate aftermath of October the 7th went on to happen. In fact, we have the very clear example of, which is very difficult to find often in genocide cases, a genocide where genocide is alleged, because you can't prove it was critical to the definition is that you actually say what you're going to do. But in this case, they said it, and it's been repeated by troops. They use the same language. And so I think this is a very important pointer to what when the ICJ finally reaches its verdict, what they're going to find.
I mean, with the Western media, do you see any signs that it will shift? Because the media narrative basically was a lot, which was basically summed up as Israel's doing a campaign of self-defense, and we can have a debate about whether it's proportionate or not, where we can agree to disagree. I mean, that's basically where the narrative stuck. Did that change? Has it changed? Will it change?
It sort of changed with the arrival of Trump. And so then particularly when Israel broke the ceasefire back in March, there was a change in narrative. And what you've got a sense of columnists and newspaper editors think, oh gosh, have I been supporting a genocide? You've got that sense, and you've got a series of articles coming out saying, it's time that Israel stopped doing it. It's been okay so far. This has been, by the way, about 50,000, probably many more have been killed. 15,000 children. It's time that Israel's gone too far. Yeah, that sort of article became a phenomenon. I thought that would be followed by a general revulsion against what Israel has done, but we haven't seen that, and quite the opposite. In many ways, this ceasefire by Trump is seen as some sort of triumph for Netanyahu. It's been struck between. Remember that Netanyahu is wanted for war crimes, alleged war crimes, I should say. Trump is a convicted felon. These two countries, United States and Israel, has been a partnership essentially in what most genocide experts think of as a genocide, most respectable figures in the field. And then they hammer out between them, with a bit of aid apparently from Britain's Tony Blair, and one or two other property developer types, what is hailed universally in the British as some sort of peace deal, which is nothing of the sort. Since then, Israel has persistently broken it on numerous occasions, killing, I think now, well over 100 Palestinians.
That was overnight. So just to be clear, it said overnight they killed that many. They killed at least 104 Palestinians overnight.
I didn't know that.
Which they and they'd already killed around 90 before that since the ceasefire began.
And imagine how Hamas had come out of this. You tweeted of something to this effect, I think, this morning. I mean, imagine if Hamas had come out of this statement, which Netanyahu came out today. I mean, it would have been Hamas smashes the ceasefire, Hamas this, Hamas that. Splat headlines everywhere. Instead of which, the media coverage is, the ceasefire in jeopardy as, or I mean, it's not the. It is another example of how the Western media is very seriously biased in favour of the Israeli perspective. Just
finally. Just in terms of accountability, I mean, firstly, I'm interested in what you think about, because one of the planks of I think complicity is how those opposed to the genocide were demonized, those who were trying to basically abide actually by what international law, for example, said, what actually Britain's international commitments would obligate the government to do and how to behave. But also, moving on from that, I mean, do you think there's any chance that the likes of Keir Starmer, David Cameron, David Lammy could end up facing charges for their role in one of the great crimes of our age?
I do think it's worthy of reiteration that the peace marchers, who week after week after week have given up their weekends to make a statement that they want a ceasefire and to march against what they see as a genocide, have been represented persistently by the media as sort of anti-Semitic or Hamas supporters or enemies of Western civilization. They have also been represented as violent. There's no evidence of this. No serious evidence of this. Quite the opposite. They've been extremely peaceful, extremely principled, whereas, and all they are supporting is the international moral order as set up by Winston Churchill and Roosevelt at the end of World War II. On the other hand, Britain, the United States, Netanyahu's Israel, are dedicated to smashing that order. They have persistently attacked the United Nations. They've killed more than 300 UNRWA aid workers, more than 200 journalists. They have slaughtered civilians. They tried to twist and pervert the International Criminal Court. Americans have actually sanctioned the chief prosecutor of it. They are systemically hostile to the international world order, which we claim to be ours, which Britain played a fantastic role in creating. That's what, these protesters, almost every British newspaper has condemned them for being Hamas fans, and there's an industry in pillaring them. These are fabulous people. They're honourable people. They're also in the tradition of the suffragettes, the Stop the War marches, the Ban the Bomb I mean, the Chartists. There's a fantastic tradition in Britain, in our country, of decency and standing up for the underdog and standing against barbarism. And that's what they've been doing, and they've been pilloried for it. But history will forgive them. It won't just forgive them, it will celebrate them.
And what do you think about the prospects of charges for the likes of Keir Starmer?
I think they're nearly certain. I mean, very interesting work is going on. That it may well be that America will succeed in actually destabilizing and killing off the International Criminal Court. Nevertheless, there's very interesting moves going on to find alternatives. You have to remember that it's a tiny group of Western nations which have set about deliberately to trash the international order. There are now, in the international moral order, there are real efforts going on elsewhere. You'll probably find South Africa is a fantastic example of this, which the Rainbow Nation, which emerged from apartheid, which, needless to say, was supported by the United States and Britain and the Western powers, may emerge in one of the leaders of this. I also think that it has to be remembered that under British law, not even international law, aiding or abetting a genocide is a criminal offence. Now, once the ICJ rules, it's taking rather a long time, I think it will rule it's been a genocide. I think that will open up a number of British ministers and others to criminal prosecution. Now, they are protected by the fact that Tony Blair received similar advice in the run-up to the Iraq War, by the fact that the British Attorney General is responsible for this decision, and it's since he's the appointee of a British Prime Minister, it's most unlikely that he will go ahead. But I think this is a much bigger thing than Whitehall realises. There's a change in public mood. I'd be very interested to see whether if a government which contains the Greens, led by Zach Polanski.
Yeah.
Sorry, I apologise. Yes,
he's a new kid on the block, but he's getting cut through.
Yes, that's right. What his view of what his orders to to the Attorney General would be, I think at the very least it's going to become very difficult for certain ministers and former ministers to travel abroad. I think international red notices are going to crop up. But it's worth saying that we have a precedent. I think it's a disaster that Tony Blair wasn't held to account for the illegal invasion of Iraq 20 years ago. I think it'll be different this time round.
I agree. I think the scale of the crime is just too big, too documented, too confessed to. And I think the power of the global south is much bigger than it was of the West and much weaker. I think there's lots of reasons why this is completely different. Peter, honestly, it's such an honour. This is such a crucial book. And I think, as I've said many times, it's accountability in this horror is so important, because if we normalise this level of depravity and just the violations of any basic norms of, warfare and international law, all the rest, whatever we think about how the West picks and chooses what international law and always has, if we normalise this level of depravity, particularly given the political context when the far right is on the rise in so many places, then we are paving the way not just for the destruction of the Palestinians, but I would fear for the future of all of us. It's so important we get accountability. And Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza by Peter Oborne is a book which I think people read long, long after the event to look back and understand that people knew at the time what was happening. It wasn't like they could say, "Oh, I didn't know," and it was a different time. If I knew then what I knew now, that's what people said about Iraq. No such excuses exist. So make sure you get a copy, and do encourage everyone else to do the same. Leave your comments. Live to hear what you think. Press like. Good to get people watching the video. Share the video. But Peter, honestly, always an honour, and thanks so much for this crucial piece of journalism.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm really grateful. And let's hope we can change the world. I think Gaza will change the world, actually. I think we're going to, in a funny way, I travel around a lot of the place, and it's always interesting that the regimes in place are nervous because they're supporting Israel, they're supporting the United States. And Gaza is becoming a cause for the oppressed around the world, of people, and the people who feel that something's wrong about the world is wrong. And I think that the world is changing.
Amen. I think you're absolutely right.